I'm Marcus Smith, and this is Constant Wonder. Every morning, we awake to a world marvelously alive. Where do we encounter awe and wonder in this world? In animals and plants, in deserts, on mountains, in forests, ocean and sky, in history, art and science, in human striving and human kindness. Join us as we quest for the awe and wonder of knowing we are part of something infinitely larger than ourselves. It's a rare person who never loses their childlike wonder, but we do meet the occasional adult who has successfully hung on to this innate sense that everything in the world is secretly amazing. In fact, I'm going to introduce you to such a person right now. Thor Hanson by name. Thor's attention to the natural world is rare, and it's a delight to be swept along with him to the places, plants, and animals he loves. Today we're going to wander through a few stories from Thor that will revive your own childhood thrill over things immediately before our eyes, but hidden or overlooked, perhaps. They're right close to home. Doesn't matter where you live. I don't think there's an adequate term for people like Thor. We might benefit from some designation a little less formal than conservation biologist. So I've coined a word for him. He's a life keeper. Thor sees wonder in every living thing, and he wants to keep that life going.
Oh, I love the phrase life keeper, and I think it's very accurate. I mean, I was always the kid with the cooler full of snakes he'd caught in the woods and turning over rocks and catching stuff and going out fishing, and I loved that sort of interaction with nature. But I don't think I really had a plan to be a scientist or a conservationist until I began to experience some sense of loss in nature. And one formative experience would have been this wonderful little glade that my brother and I used to walk up to in the woods behind our place. And it was our spot. You know, we had a little, not a fort exactly, but we'd camp out up there sometimes and take snacks. And it was this mossy, wonderful place. And wouldn't you know it, we went up there once, and the place had been basically paved over, cleared, and it was being prepped for a house site. And it was just a gut punch. That was probably in my early teens, to lose that place. And not too long after that, when I went off to college, I moved from a fairly rural and small town upbringing where I had a lot of exposure to nature. And that was the place that we were so connected to that was developed, and we lost it. It awakened that sense of not just loss, but risk, and what is at risk everywhere as we rapidly expand this human population and our impacts on the planet. So that was the beginning, I think, of the conservation part of my experience.
Thor Hanson is author of Close to Home, The Wonders of Nature Just Outside Your Door. Even early on in life, he didn't just want to be out and about in nature, he wanted to protect it. Losing that favorite mossy spot was a turning point in his boyhood, setting him up for what he would do when grown. As a life keeper, he started to sense how much the places and creatures he valued needed protection, not just in his beloved San Juan Islands, but everywhere. If you're not familiar with the San Juan Islands, they rise from the Salish Sea off the coast of Washington in the Pacific Northwest. Morning fog, Sitka spruce and red cedar trees, croaking cormorants, and the barking of sea lions. Having grown up on these islands, Thor's subsequent work in biology was an easy fit.
I would also put on the short list of important developments for me, though, as a young, budding biologist, actually had to do with bald eagles and with glaucous-winged gulls, which are the most common gull in the San Juan Islands. And as a child, you know, it was a time during the 70s when the eagle populations were at a real low after they had been decimated across North America, really, by exposure to DDT. So to see an eagle, even in the San Juans, was a big deal. They were there, but they weren't around every day. And at some point as a kid, I realized that the gulls were telling me when the eagles were nearby. because the gulls and the eagles are enemies. They don't get along. The eagles like to raid the nests of gulls and their young and even attack adult gulls and so forth. So when an eagle was in the neighborhood, the gulls had a special cry that they would make, a call of alarm and distress. And I realized that sort of like at the time, there was this popular TV show called MASH, where one of the characters was named Radar, and he could hear the choppers coming before anyone else. I had then, by listening to the gulls, the ability to tell people, hey, there's an eagle coming. And sure enough, here would come this bald eagle. And it was a fun party trick as a kid, and no one could figure out why I always knew when the eagles were coming. And I didn't tell anyone. It was my little secret. But it also opened this window for me into nature as more than scenery, more than a backdrop, more than just a place you like to spend time. I realized that animals and birds and all of the interacting pieces of that puzzle were communicating and interacting. And if you paid attention, you could be a part of that conversation. And that, I think, was really important to me in terms of my interest in and connection to the natural world.
Let's go back for just a moment now to that little glade that you and your brother loved so much. Would you walk us through a scenario of what kind of happened there? School's out, maybe? What's the typical plan?
I think you hit on it. I think it's the lack of plan that was, in some ways, the attraction. In that a lot of our lives in this world are regimented, and as a child, you're in school or you have activities and expectations around you and so forth. But when you're released out into nature, there's no plan. You experience what you find, and you let your curiosity guide you, and you invent games, or you turn over a rock and you see what you find. And it is that lack of plan that, in a sense, at least as for me as a child, was one of the great attractions to nature.
So put me right on San Juan Island, where you have no plan, you're with your brother. I grew up in San Diego in California, so we were looking for trapdoor spiders, we were looking for spider webs, tarantulas, we were hoping to see a lizard. I've never been to San Juan Island.
Well, you've got a wonderful forest, several different kinds in that neighborhood, where you had a sort of Douglas fir forest with wonderful big conifer trees, mossy understory and shrubs. We also had a wonderful forest filled with alder trees, which is a deciduous tree, a beautiful silvery bark deciduous tree. And in terms of the lack of plan, I can lead you right through an experience in that alder forest that became a regular part of our routine as kids in the neighborhood. It's a lovely forest, but it had grown up all at the same time. And so some of the trees had succeeded and become the canopy trees in the forest, but there were a lot of smaller trees that had been shaded out and died. And so we realized at some point that even the small bodies of an 8-10-year-old were strong enough to pull over these dead trees. And so you could run and jump up into a tree, and it would all come crashing down around you. And then you'd have, a broken tree trunk that might have beetles in it or all kinds of stuff. So we had these wonderful games where we would run around feeling larger than life, breaking up trees and seeing what we might find. And it was absolutely experiential. Had no idea, it was driven by being out there and being curious and yanking on stuff and seeing what might happen.
When you head out into nature without any real premeditated plan, but a willingness to be waylaid by any number of surprises, you'll end up seeing more. Eye-catching flora and fauna, mysterious configurations of earth or stone or water, interrelationships between various members of an ecosystem. I suspect part of what makes Thor today still such a fantastic advocate for living things is this childlike openness to observing almost aimlessly. It's that mode of approaching the world the way he did back in his childhood days. You can't really plan things that are unplanned. You can't get to know the unknown before you know it. So Thor has developed powers of observation propelled by a childlike, unrelenting curiosity.
I had found these, what are called galls, on the twigs of a plant, a common shrub here in the Northwest called thimbleberry. And I thought, well, what's making that gall? I bet it's still in there. So I grabbed one of those and I put it in a jar and put it on a shelf. And then months later, I glanced over there and here were all these little insects that had come out of that gall. And I thought, what are those things? And they're so small, I needed my hand lens, to get a really good look at them. And here they were wasps, tiny gall wasps, these tiny, and they were beautifully iridescent. And then I realized, my God, there's more than one kind here. And opened this world into the world of these gall-making wasps and the parasites that attack them. And it went on and on. It was just fantastic.
Well, just when was this?
I would have been in my 20s probably when I did that. So it's probably about 30 years ago that I discovered those. I mean, I discovered them for myself. And I should say that in science, we often think that once something's been discovered, then it's written down and we're done with the discovery. But we can repeat. I mean, someone obviously knew about gall wasps, but it was a discovery to me. And that sense of, wonder, if you will, was just as fresh as it was for, I'm sure, whoever first noticed them.
What that story told me was that as somebody who is a keeper of life, a conservation biologist, and likes thimbleberries and likes to look at galls on the berries, it seems that there's something innate in you that wants to help life thrive.
It just continues. I recently led a field walk here in the San Juan Islands. I was asked to lead this field walk for a local conservation group. And I love doing that anyway, because it's fun to explore it and see what we find with people. But I was particularly attracted to the location in that it was a nature reserve that I had worked on as a very young biologist, probably still in college. My summer job was working for a local conservation group. And I put together the first plant list I'd ever put together, the first bird list I'd ever put together was for this property. So before going out there to lead this walk, I looked back at those old notes and I could just remember everything was so new to me. Every time I got a name on a plant, it was just a revelation. I'd see a bird and figure out what it was. It was just this incredible rush. And then I thought to myself, I feel exactly the same way today. It just never stops because there's so much out there to learn. And I may know the common things in the flora. I may recognize most of the bird songs I hear. And, after 30, 40 years of doing this, there are things that are familiar. But in some ways, knowing the familiar just points out how much is left that you don't know, these little things that you haven't put a name to yet, these little interactions you've never observed. And I told the people on that walk at the beginning, I said, one thing I can guarantee is we are going to see things on this walk that I have never seen before. And that is truly exciting.
Well, that is quite a claim to make. You've amassed all of this life experience, and then you're still claiming to see things you've never seen before. Take me someplace where you've recently seen something for the first time. Is it within the last couple of days, within a week, within a month?
Oh, it happens. It happens constantly. And in fact, on that walk, I was showing folks bumblebees, and I was showing them a little blue butterfly we have in the fauna here called the spring azure, a lovely little butterfly that's very common. And all these things were happening on this cluster of flowers, and I was pointing things out and sharing them with people. And I noticed this other butterfly pop into that group of flowers. And then someone asked a question, and I didn't have time to look at it really, and we were walking away, and I thought, that butterfly was different. I wish that I had had a chance to really look at it. But lo and behold, if one of the people on the trip didn't take a picture of it, just happenstance, and she sent me some pictures later, and here was the picture of this butterfly, and it was a species that I have never seen in San Juan County in my life. A beautiful butterfly called the cedar hairstreak, whose larvae feed on cedar trees or juniper trees, and as far as I know, it's the first one ever seen on that particular island, and I'd never seen one before. So it just, things just keep happening.
So if Thor Hanson, even after years doing professional conservation biology, can apply some simple attentiveness to his own San Juan stomping grounds and stumble across a butterfly that's never been seen in that location before, imagine what any one of us might find if we were to slow our pace, attentively observing whatever surrounds us in any given moment. I'm Marcus Smith, and this is the Constant Wonder podcast from BYU Radio. Have you grown weary of news coverage that feeds off anger and division, and yet you still want to engage with important issues? Well, let me introduce you to Top of Mind. It's another podcast from the BYU Radio family. Each week, the Top of Mind team, with award-winning host Julie Rose, undertakes a careful analysis of one tough topic. The goal is learning how to stay open and curious when confronted with perspectives that challenge us. And best of all, every episode will leave you feeling hopeful and better able to become an effective advocate for what matters to you. Top of Mind. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder. By keeping a watchful eye out for marvels right on his own turf close to home, Thor Hanson is actually following in the tradition of many a great naturalist of history, including Charles Darwin, in fact, whom we wrongly think of as having led a peripatetic life. Yes, he did have that one long trip to the Galapagos, just about as far away from home as he could possibly get. But few of us realize that the bulk of his life's work thereafter never required a ship or a train or even a horse to go very far at all, because he continued his observations of various life forms right at home for years on end. So if Charles Darwin were with us today, he would probably say, "I've done that in my yard too."
You're darn right. It's hard. I mean, I'm still surprised by all the things he ended up looking at over the course of his career. And he did most of it at home. He's famous, of course, for his journey on the Beagle around the world, HMS Beagle, where they stopped famously in the Galapagos and other places. And he started to come up with groundbreaking ideas. But he was a homebody. After that ship docked back in England, he never left the British Isles again, and he rarely left home. He didn't even like to go up to London for a meeting. He wanted to be in the yard doing these experiments, making observations, and adding to just the reams of knowledge he was building up to try to flesh out these ideas about evolution.
Was that world of his yard right at home, never leaving England again, just watching the insects and the life forms there? I mean, he'd been to the Galapagos, for crying out loud. You'd think the Wanderlust would kick in every single season that you could catch the next ship. But that small world, was that big enough for him?
It certainly seemed to be. And I think you could argue that, he probably had the best of both worlds, because he did have that broad global experience, and that probably stimulated certain ideas that may not have been stimulated if everything had been in the yard. But combining the two gave him great insight into specific things he was observing and much broader patterns in nature.
Well, I would guess the same sort of thing happened to you, because early in your career, you found yourself in Uganda, near that Burundi impenetrable forest, and that's far afield from the Pacific Northwest. And then now sometimes you're just the homebody too.
It is. It's a fortunate thing to have that combination of experiences. And I can certainly see how experiences abroad have informed the way I look at nature here. And there's one in particular from Burundi. That was a wonderful sort of jackpot job that I ended up with when I joined the Peace Corps, where I was working with wild mountain gorillas in that forest. But one of the stories that sticks with me from there, in addition to the gorilla work, was actually about bees. And not bumblebees or honeybees, some of the more familiar bees, but these tiny little black bees that were common there that I didn't even know were bees for the first part of my time there. You can imagine it's hot and you're out hiking in the forest, following primates around, and we have swarms of insects clouding around us, and they're on your skin, and you're kind of brushing them off. And that had been going on for weeks or months before I looked closely enough to realize those tiny little pencil points, those little black things, were not flies, they were bees. And I was just gobsmacked. I mean, I couldn't believe these perfect little bees. And they're stingless, so they were perfectly harmless. And it wasn't long after that a Ugandan graduate student came down from Makerere University, the flagship university there in the capital, to the forest to study those bees for his master's thesis. And every day he was going out into the forest looking for these things and trying to do his research, but he became really frustrated. And he told us that he just couldn't find the nests of these bees. The bees were common, but where were they nesting? And if, he didn't find the nest, he couldn't do this project. That he could sort of see his thesis disintegrating in front of his eyes. And the advice that we gave him was to talk to members of the Batwa tribe, the Pygmies, who had for generations called that forest home and still had deep connections to it. And so he went over and he hired one of these fellows for a day to go into the forest and show him around and try to find some bees. And they went out to a clearing. And Vincent, this Ugandan student, told me later that he sat down with the fellow in this little glade. Here we are at another forest glade. And they sat down and waited, looking at these flowers. And then, sure enough, a bee appears, one of these stingless bees. And then they watch it on the flower, and then it disappears. And they wait, and after a bit, back and wait. And this goes on for a while, a surprising long time. And he said, I was starting to wonder, what am I paying this guy for? When the man stood up, he said, okay, we go. And they walked into the forest at a fairly brisk pace and walked a certain distance. And then the man slowed down and he looked around and he looked around and he pointed to a rotten stump, and there was the bee nest. And what he had done, how he had done that, was watching the bees visit that flower. He knew the flowers that they liked, so he knew where to go. And then he watched the direction that the bee was flying. So he knew what direction the nest was. And then he, in his head, timed how long it took the bee to make a round trip. And since he was familiar with how fast a bee flew, he knew about how far it was. And he knew that species of bee liked rotten stumps, so he walked that distance, looked around, there's the stump, simple. And that story has stuck with me because I think it shows what we are all capable of when we live with nature as a lifestyle and not as an occasional indulgence, right? When you really live in a place and amass that deep knowledge of the natural world, our powers of observation are extremely acute, and we could all be tracking bees in a jungle if we spent enough time there.
Have you seen something lately? I know you don't think of that category of that's unnatural because it's city and this is natural because it's more rural or out in the wilderness. I know that that's not the lens you use, but given that template, have you been somewhere recently where you said, wow, that thing's alive and it's here?
There are surprises almost anywhere. And one that I can think of quite recently was in my community. The most developed place is the center of our little town, the county seat and so forth. It has all the coffee shops and the grocery stores and the typical things we expect, and a lot of pavement. And I was walking along and a little bee passed me, and I noticed a lot of green. And there are green bees in the world. I will tell you, there's some beautiful bright green orchid bees. There are even some green bees here in North America, but this was not a green bee. It was carrying something green, and I thought, oh my gosh, it's a leafcutter. And we have a lot of leafcutter bees in North America. They build their little nests in holes in wood or in the ground, and they line the nests with leaves. They cut off pieces of leaves, and they make these beautiful little cells of leaves where they will put pollen and lay their eggs and so on and so forth. It's a wonderful little lifestyle they've developed. But what's this leafcutter doing in downtown on a sunny afternoon? So I followed it, and sure enough, it flew right down into a crack between pavements in the sidewalk. And right in that little crack, there was enough soil, enough that it could get in there, and it had dug its little hole, and it took that leaf in and disappeared, came out a minute later, went back for more. And it was just so refreshing to see that life in such a developed spot. And there was the leafcutter bee. It found a niche, and it was using it.
Not everybody has the inclination to follow that story to its end in the sidewalk. I try to see, I try to hear, listen. There are times when I can be surprised in my own yard by what I find. Is it just a matter of doing the time?
I have a couple of suggestions for you, but one is not just time, but perspective. And by that, I mean, change how you look at something familiar. I mean, have you ever crawled through your yard or your neighborhood park on your hands and knees? You might get some funny looks from the neighbors, but you're bound to see things differently, moving in a different way through it at a different level. You suddenly like, where did all these spider webs come from? And then, my gosh, if there are all these spider webs, they must be catching something down here. What are the insects they're preying upon? And it's a whole world, right?
Access to the fascinating world Thor is talking about comes with a willingness to indulge our innate curiosity and maybe stop rushing everywhere we go. We can let the eyes and ears calm down enough to rest on some scene or dwell with a nearby object. Here's an example for us all that Thor really likes, a fellow at Harvard in the 1860s by the name of Samuel Scudder. Scudder was studying under a renowned professor there named Louis Agassiz, and what he observed as a student gives us an idea of what could happen to any of us in our nearby or immediate surroundings if we become attentive to things.
It's a marvelous, marvelous example of the powers of observation. And this occurred in the 19th century. And Scudder was a brand new student. He was an entomologist. He'd gotten into this wonderful lab under Louis Agassiz, who was this great naturalist of the era. And Scudder was so excited to meet him and get started on his work. And he came in and he said, I'm a new student. I'm going to be an entomologist, and I want to start now, right? And Scudder says this to Agassiz, and Agassiz, he's so excited. This is going to be great. And he reaches behind him and he gets this big glass container full of formaldehyde or alcohol or some kind of preservative, and there's this fish in it, this dead fish. And he says, here, look at this fish, and write down everything that you see. I'll check on you in a while. And so Scudder's kind of nonplussed. He's interested in insects. And here this great naturalist gives him a fish. And like, all right. And plus it's stinky. So he pulls the thing out and puts it on a lab tray, and he sits there and he makes a sketch of it and says a few things. And then the professor comes back and says, well, what have you seen? What have you found? And he tells him, well, it's got scales and fins and so on. And he's totally disappointed. So you haven't seen anything. Look at your fish. Look at your fish. And over the course, not just of the afternoon, but into the next day, over the course of days, he continues to examine the fish until finally he starts to see all of these patterns. He sees that the fish is bilaterally symmetrical. One side is the same as the other, and he sees the patterns in the scales, and he sees how it must have grown. He starts to see all of these things, and then the professor gets really excited. So he brings him another fish. And soon he has sat there and he's learned enough about this family of fishes to draw them all, to see the relationships between them, to see how they evolved and diversified over time. And Scudder said he never went on to study fish. From that experience, he moved into the insects that he was passionate about, and he became a very successful entomologist. But that lesson in the powers of observation and looking at something, even something that he came to just detest at first, this stinky old fish, taught him something that guided his career forever, just what you can see if you look carefully.
A couple of weeks ago, Thor, I was hiking in a place called Rock Canyon here in Provo, Utah, in the Wasatch Mountains. And I ran across 3 different individuals, each of whom were using Merlin on their phones to try to identify birds. I remember one fellow, he was just intensely focused on this. And I stopped and I chatted with him. He said he had heard for the first time in his life what he thought was a black-throated gray warbler. He says, I know they're in the area, but I've never had a visual on it, and I want to see it. And Merlin tells me it's here. More power to people who do that. At the same time, that's one kind of engagement. It's learning. It's scientific curiosity. Is there something more that we're called upon to do by the world around us than observe it?
It's a wonderful question. I like the story in that this user was using Merlin as an entry point. I think a lot of these tools that we now have that are so incredible right there on our phones, you've got these supercomputers, you've got the Naturalist can help identify things, or Merlin can help you with birds. But if it starts and ends on the phone, that can be, sort of a dead end. But when the phone, that application is an introduction, that can open doors to nature. So I love that part of the story. And in terms of being a keeper of nature or conserving nature, it's one thing that we talk about a lot, among scientists, conservation biologists, nature writers, and so forth in this community, is that people can't care about things they don't know about. And so the experience of learning about that warbler is more likely to make that person connect to that place in a way that when that valley or the rock, what was it called? Rock Canyon?
Rock Canyon.
When that comes up now, if it were to come up for sale, you probably have a person there who is ready to take a stand because of this incredible experience they had there. So learning about the natural world can help us to care about it. And if we don't know about it at all, it's much easier to turn a blind eye when bad things happen to nature.
Yeah. I don't know of a kid who doesn't go to school and at some point a Dixie cup is shoved into their hands with some soil and they're given maybe a pumpkin seed or a sunflower seed. I had that happen to me, and I thought it was, at that time, well, these are well-meaning adults, and they're probably trying to do their jobs. It wasn't, though, until I was away from school. My grandmother had a flower garden, and I went to her home in the summers, and when she gave me seeds, suddenly those seeds mattered to me. And I took them from Utah to my home in San Diego, and I stuck them in the ground, and I had a little bit of success. But there was a spark for me as a kid when I got to understand that seeds have this remarkable power. And maybe this would be great for a kid to hear too, that a seed is what? The lunchbox analogy.
Yeah, it's a baby plant in a box with its lunch.
That's what a seed is.
Yes. Which is true. It's a wonderful little summation of the evolution of seeds. I love it. I got that from Carol Baskin, who is a wonderful scientist and seed expert, and she had taught botany for decades, and that's what she would tell her botany.
So Carol Baskin's image is the shell of the seed is the lunchbox, and the little plant is inside there, you said, with its lunch. So it's
with its lunch.
So it has to start eating something on the inside in its lunchbox in order for that lunchbox to open up and then for it to grow?
Precisely. So if you think of that baby plant being sent off into the world by the parent tree, they, in many cases, send them with something to eat to get a good start, to get some nutrition out there, because it takes energy to sprout and to grow, particularly until you've made a few leaves so you can start to make energy from the sun and grow on your own. And so in the typical seed, there is a lunch for that baby plant, and that's the energy it's going to use to sprout and begin to grow.
I've seen a walnut start sprouting, and that had a little lunchbox around it. That works for me.
Yeah. Yeah. So you can see it, and you can see the differences in terms of the size of the lunch based on the strategy for that plant to thrive in wherever it may end up. One of the biggest seeds around is inside of an avocado, right? It has that enormous seed in there. That's a huge lunch for the baby plant. And if you take an avocado seed and do that classic experiment where you try to get it to germinate and sprout in a jar of water, dangle it into a jar with some toothpicks holding it up, and eventually you'll get the root coming out. Then you can plant it in a pot and you'll get a little avocado tree starting. You can go back later, 6 months, a year later, and you'll still see those halves of that seed still there. They're withered, they're small, but they still are providing a bit of nutrition to that young plant. And the reason for that is that avocados evolved in a dark sort of rainforest setting where you're not going to see sunlight as a baby plant, much of it, for a long time. And so the parent tree packs in a huge lunch for the baby because they know it might have to sit out there in the shade for a long time before a gap opens up that will give it some sunlight so it can really thrive and grow on its own.
Well, I told you my story of being in kindergarten and having a seed thrust into my life. Were you keen on seeds when you were little?
I had gardening experiences when I was a kid, in that my mother had a vegetable garden. So the seeds were important to me in that among the tasks that one could be assigned in the garden, there was weeding, which I did not enjoy, but there was also planting. And she would often give me my own bed to plant and allow me to plant in my own way. And so my favorite seed experience as a child was carrot seeds planted in a big spiral in this garden. So there was a big spiral of carrot plants that came up. It was much, much easier to eat my carrots when I knew that I had grown them and grown them in my own way in a spiral in the garden.
At this stage in your career, you're back on San Juan Island in the same general area, the Pacific Northwest. That's kind of a return. Is it a homecoming? Is it a settling down for a world traveler?
I think at least for me, and again, my sample size is small. I've only got one brain to rattle around within. But from my perspective, what is brought home from that sort of traveling biologist experience is, in a sense, the ability to see more at home. And we've spoken about new discoveries, things that, that I keep learning right in my own backyard, essentially. And I think the ability to do that is built upon, in some ways, the observations that I made abroad. And learning to see, because if you go out, I don't care how many times you've hiked in your rock canyon, even if you've put names on things, you don't know how they're interacting. You don't know what their habits are. Go out there and bird watch. You know where the birds are. Well, let me ask you this. Where do they spend the night? Where do all those birds sleep? Some of those birds, they might be your closest neighbors. You have no idea where they're sleeping. So you go out at dusk and you try to follow them. They're going to be going to their roosting spot overnight. Find it. Can you find it? It's really hard to do, but it's totally gratifying. And you add to your connection to the place by taking the time and allowing your curiosity to lead you on those close to home sorts of journeys.
Last night, I was out at about 9:15, and the finches were still gathering birdseed that I had put out in the yard. They were still coming that late, and I thought, isn't it your bedtime? But you're right, I don't know where they went to sleep. I have no idea.
Yeah. Where did they go? They're going someplace, and it's close by.
I hope you heard my confession there. I was admitting to Thor that I didn't follow those finches. It's probably all too human. I had contented myself with merely identifying them, because years ago I bought a field guide, and at some point I must have looked them up to get to know them. Then additionally, I recently finally got around to downloading the free Merlin app from the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, and I've been reacquainting myself with the song of birds like house finches using that app. But if you really pressed me with the question of precisely when I had my last eureka moment of new understanding about nature that goes beyond just identification, well, I think it's been way too long for me. Hearing Thor talk this over with his trademark enthusiasm, well, he's just the kind of role model I need. Here's a story he had up his sleeve that resonated with me and I think it probably will with you too. It's a classic eureka moment story. This happened to him because he was willing to observe in a new way, this time on a very dark night in a patch of rainforest with a flashlight in hand.
One of the ways that I think we can all, refocus attention in nature that I enjoy is to go out after dark, which is when we tend to see the least nature because we're inside and we don't think of going out into that darkness. But if you go outside with a flashlight, with a pretty narrow beam, it focuses your attention in a way that is very hard to do in daylight when you see so much. So when you have a focused beam of a flashlight, suddenly that's all you can see, that one illuminated spot, and you can start to notice things. And I would do this in various places, but I did it once at a research station down in Central America that is one of the most heavily used stations by tropical scientists anywhere, a place called La Selva in Costa Rica. And I was out there with my flashlight after hours, poking around, looking what I could see in my beam. And my beam passed over this perfect hole. And I looked back and I realized it was a nest, a sort of a ball-shaped nest with a perfect little hole that was the entry point. And I thought, my gosh, who's made that nest? And so I came back the next day in the daylight and I watched these striped-breasted wrens going in and out of that nest. And I never would have seen it in the day, because in the day you have all of that tropical vegetation. You've got lianas and trees and heliconias coming up from the ground, and there's so much to look at, it's overwhelming, and you would never, ever see that nest. But because I had focused my attention with a flashlight, I found it and was able to then watch them and describe their behavior. And what was great about it is the location. I also realized that in fact, the nests of that species were almost unknown. So the simple notes that I made about it could be published and add to our knowledge of them. So that's a nice little scientific thing. But the location of the nest, it was suspended in this group of lianas directly above the trail connecting the dormitories to the dining hall at this very busy tropical research station. So all of these scientists, including myself, had been walking directly underneath it day after day without ever seeing it. And it took that sort of refocusing of my attention to notice it right there in plain sight.
So what I'm processing now, Thor, is that for somebody who grew up like me, I went into the humanities. I didn't go into the sciences. I became a hiker. I became a gardener, a birder. And so my acquaintance with the living world it's there. But make a case for the value for a layperson spending time in their backyard, observing things, if it doesn't lead to sort of this systematic science?
Oh, what a wonderful question. So I have two answers, and I hope I don't take so long in the first that I forget to come back to the second. But the first part of the answer is that you don't have to be that expert. Anyone with a passing interest in nature, through the rubric of citizen science or community science, as it's often called now as well, where there are a lot of scientists in the world, but there aren't enough to gather all the data that we need to do our work. And there are a lot more people out there. There's a lot more data that needs to be gathered. So reaching out has become habitual now for many scientists. And there are all these great projects where you can participate and use simple skills to inform these bigger projects. One of my favorite examples is the BioScan project in Los Angeles, which began when the curator of insects at the Los Angeles Museum of Natural History was bragging at a donor luncheon at the museum, I could find a new species of insect anywhere. And one of the trustees of the museum took him up on the challenge. He said, if you can find a new species in my backyard, I will throw a grand fundraiser dinner party in celebration. And to add pressure, she went ahead and scheduled the party. So this guy was on the spot, and he set up a trap, and he was a little nervous because he didn't get it set up until a couple weeks before this party. But the first sample he brought back to his lab and started pulling out the insects, and he's the one that has that expertise, right? Not for fishes, but for a particular family of flies. The very first one he looked at, he didn't recognize, and he went to all of his his books and he didn't recognize it, and it was a species new to science. And so that got him through the fundraiser party, of course, but it also told him that these backyards and neighborhood parks and places in the urban environment were worthy of exploration. And they started partnering with people all across Los Angeles in putting up insect traps in these totally overlooked places. And they've already discovered more than 50 species, new to science, of flies and so forth. And they still have thousands of things left to examine, so it's ongoing. But I think something he told me about that project that really stuck with me was how popular those traps became in these neighborhoods. And how neighbors would lobby. They wanted the trap in their yard. They wanted to see what was in their yard. And he said, and this is true, he said that on more than one occasion, someone cried when it was time to take the trap down and move it to another yard. They had become so hooked on seeing what was there. And they didn't need that taxonomic expertise. He and his colleagues provided that. So it was this wonderful partnership. They were providing space and curiosity and volunteer effort, and he and his colleagues were providing that taxonomic expertise, and they had this incredible synergy in terms of discovery in those neighborhoods. I think that there is a healthy dose of wonder in science. I've always believed that, to borrow from the title of your show. There's certainly the intellectual thrill and that just excitement of discovery. But I really feel like there is a connection between curiosity and wonder. I mean, curiosity being the gateway in a sense. Or if you want to think of wonder as a verb rather than a noun, to wonder can be to be filled with curiosity. And that's fundamental in science. That fundamental driving passion, that curiosity that is at the root level of all scientific endeavor is curiosity. And I think that's really close to wonder. So I don't think it's a far gap at all to get from the intellect to the heart, if you will, in the scientific endeavor.
Thor Hanson's book is titled Close to Home: The Wonders of Nature Just Outside Your Door. This episode was produced by Jess Scoville with assistance from Jenna McMartin. Sound design by Gracie Davis. I'm Marcus Smith. The Constant Wonder Podcast is a production of BYU Radio. I'd like to introduce you to another show from the BYU Radio family of podcasts, The Lisa Show, hosted by comedian, believer, and single mother Lisa Valentine Clark. The Lisa Show delves into most any challenge that meets us in the course of our lives, especially challenges in the realm of human relationships, whether it's parenting, mental health questions, or social issues. Lisa and her council of moms are willing to tackle it. Figuring life out is vexing enough without losing an ability to laugh or cry together or just plain talk things through. The Lisa Show. Listen wherever you get your podcasts. We now return to Constant Wonder.